The cold flick of the check-in agent's hand sent Ethan Walker's $5,000 first-class ticket sliding across the counter, skidding along the glass edge like a slap to his pride. It happened in only a few seconds, but to Ethan it cut sharp as a blade, slicing into memories he thought he had long outgrown. He stood there in the middle of the wide O'Hare terminal, breath slowing, heart pounding, that familiar feeling returning, the one that came with being doubted, judged, inspected, simply because of his skin. Chloe Grant, the check-in agent with neatly tied blonde hair and deep red lipstick, lifted her eyes at him again, as if he were trying to enter a world that did not belong to him. "Are you sure this ticket is yours?" she asked, her tone flat and dripping with suspicion. Ethan placed a hand on the counter, trying to keep his voice steady, even though a storm churned inside his chest. "I purchased that ticket, a first-class ticket with confirmed payment," he said slowly, each word deliberate, as if trying to underline a truth she was working hard to ignore. But Chloe never met his eyes. She looked at his simple black hoodie, his faded jeans, his worn running shoes. She judged him not by the information on the screen, but by the story she imagined from his clothes, a story where someone like him did not belong in first class. That feeling being reduced to nothing in a single glance squeezed at his throat again, and this moment was no exception. Behind the rope divider, a tall white man in a crisp suit gave Ethan a single glance before muttering to his wife, "People like that in first class." Ethan heard every word, each one landing between his shoulder blades. He tightened his fist, but kept a faint smile on his lips. He had heard comments like that since high school then, in early engineering meetings, then even after becoming a CEO, when people would still ask, "Which department do you work in?" He smiled not because he was amused, but because it was the only way to keep some peace inside himself. Chloe tapped a few keys on her screen, then whispered into the internal phone. Ethan could tell instantly something was wrong, and that something had nothing to do with his ticket. It came from the way they looked at him. 5 minutes passed, and the line behind him grew irritated, but no one urged Chloe to hurry. They only pushed Ethan with their stares, as if he were the reason their day was slowing down. "Please step aside while we verify," Chloe said with a politeness wrapped in frost. Ethan looked at the digital clock behind her, the flight departing in 35 minutes. He needed this flight not only for a crucial negotiation, but because he was exhausted after 3 days of back-to-back charity events. Yet the exhaustion that weighed heaviest was not from work. It was from moments like this, moments that made him feel as though he had to prove his right to exist again and again for an entire lifetime. "I already told you my ticket is valid," Ethan said, taking a slow breath, his voice calm and low. Chloe nodded absently and added the line he always hated most, "Please stay calm." The words almost made him laugh. He had never lost his temper. People like him were not allowed to lose their temper in places like this. If he raised his voice even slightly, they would have a reason to call security, and they knew that. He knew that. Everyone in the terminal knew that. But what froze him completely was not the suspicion. It was the moment a flight attendant approached someone he had never met wearing a badge that read, "Stephanie Moore." She glanced at Ethan, then leaned toward Chloe and asked quietly, again. Ethan heard it. Every syllable. His chest tightened. "I'm sorry, sir. There is a system error," Stephanie said, without bothering to hide her irritation. "Please step aside so we can assist other passengers first." It felt like she had physically dragged him out of the line, not because of any technical reason, but because they did not want him standing there at all. A cold current slid down his spine. But he lifted his head and looked directly at Stephanie. And in that moment, something in him awakened. An old fire. Something he had learned after decades of facing prejudice. He would not step back. Not this time. Not anymore. "I am not going anywhere," Ethan said, his voice low, but carrying the force of a command. Not loud, not rude, but strong enough to make Stephanie pause. Every gaze turned toward him. Some curious, some annoyed, some openly disdainful. And in the middle of that storm of eyes, Ethan remained still, unmoving, like a rooted tree bracing against violent wind, as if the entire airport were testing whether he would break. He didn't break, but he knew the fight was only beginning, and what none of them expected was that the man they looked down on today would soon be the one deciding the fate of the entire airline. They did not know, but they were about to. And once they learned the truth, they would never forget this day. When Ethan was finally allowed to step into the first-class cabin, it felt as though he had just passed through an invisible checkpoint where no luggage scanner was needed, only judgmental eyes sorting people into categories. No one greeted him, no one smiled, and every step he took seemed to leave a trail of frost behind. Yet Ethan kept his back straight. He had endured far worse in his lifetime. Seat 1A sat by the left window, a quiet cabin bathed in warm amber light, with leather seats and the soft drift of piano music. A world designed for people deemed worthy. A space where a man in a hoodie was never expected to belong. Ethan set down his bag, lowered himself into the seat, and closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to savor whatever peace he had left before a long flight. That peace shattered like glass when a sharp voice cut through the air in front of him. "Sorry, you are in the wrong seat." Ethan opened his eyes. A man around 52 years old, weathered grey hair, dressed in a polished grey three-piece suit, stood in front of him, as if Ethan had taken something that belonged to him. The name tag on his jacket was clear Richard Caldwell. Ethan felt the man's arrogance, instantly not the ordinary kind, but the kind forged from a lifetime of doors opening without effort. 1A is my seat, Richard declared, not even bothering to check his ticket, as if it were a universal fact. Ethan lifted his own ticket, his voice calm, although his breathing shifted. "It is my seat. Seat 1A. Richard glanced at it for a single second before letting out a dry laugh. "No, I always sit here. I am a platinum guest. If there is a mistake, then it must be the system." Ethan answered with a simple line that carried both exhaustion and resolve. "The system is not wrong. You are." And that was exactly when the last person Ethan wanted to see appeared. Stephanie Moore, the flight attendant who had handled him so coldly at check-in. She approached with a smile, stretched thin and sharp as a blade. "What seems to be the issue?" Richard immediately turned to her with the entitled irritation of a man who was used to getting his way. "Someone is in my seat." Stephanie nodded, did not bother to verify anything for herself, then turned to Ethan with a polite tone wrapped around a command. "May I see your ticket again?" Ethan could feel the eyes of the cabin on him, half curious, half judgmental. He handed her the ticket. Stephanie looked at it briefly, then addressed Richard first, as if the decision ultimately belonged to him. "Mr. Caldwell, the system lists you in seat 1B, the aisle seat." Richard frowned, each wrinkle tightening with annoyance. "Unacceptable. I do not sit in the aisle. I requested the window." Stephanie bowed her head with unnecessary sympathy. "I understand. You are a platinum guest. We always try to meet your preferences." Then she turned to Ethan. What she said next froze the air. Would you be willing to move to seat 1B to assist our platinum guest? Ethan stared at her, unable to believe it, yet all too familiar with it. I chose the window seat so I could sleep on this overnight flight. I paid for that. Richard leaned in slightly, directing his words straight toward Stephanie. I am not comfortable sitting next to someone like him. Ethan heard every syllable. Stephanie heard them too, and she did not protest, did not correct him, did not defend him. Instead, she gave a small nod, as if that discrimination were normal, as if it were an unspoken airline policy. Ethan's chest tightened with heat, not from anger alone, but from the old ache of never belonging, an ache that had followed him all his life. Before Ethan could speak, Stephanie lifted the internal phone. Less than 1 minute later, Mark Peters, the customer service manager, approached. What seems to be the issue? But the question was not directed at Ethan. Mark looked straight at Richard. Mr. Caldwell, is there anything inconvenient for you? Ethan cut in. I am in the correct seat, and I have no obligation to give it up for anyone. Mark turned to him with cool indifference. Mr. Walker, we reserve the right to adjust seating to ensure comfort for our frequent guests. Ethan asked, his voice no longer soft. What explanation do you have for why I, the only black passenger in this cabin, am the one being asked to move? Mark hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Then his tone hardened. You are causing a disturbance. If you do not cooperate, we will have to ask you to leave the aircraft. Ethan felt every eye lock onto him. In that suspended moment, he wondered how many times he would have to prove he was not the problem. How many times he would be forced to endure unfounded suspicion. He had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had done nothing wrong. But they had already decided he was the disruption. Mark signaled to 2 security officers positioned near the cockpit door. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked straight into Mark's eyes, and his own carried something no one there could understand, the light of a man who had endured too much, yet still refused to fall. You are mistaken, Ethan said quietly. I am not the problem. But those words didn't save him from what came next. The moment Richard smiled in satisfaction, the moment Stephanie subtly stepped aside to clear space for security, the moment Mark delivered the line Ethan would remember forever. So please leave the aircraft. Ethan understood something profound. This moment would change everything, not just this flight, not just tonight, but the entire future of this airline. And they, the people looking at him with disdain, had no idea they had just pushed the wrong man out of his seat. A man whose power reached far beyond every platinum status in existence. This series was only beginning. The moment the 2 security officers approached, Ethan felt the first-class cabin shrink into a tight metal box, every stare locking him into the role they had already assigned him. The troublemaker, the one who didn't belong, the one who needed to be removed so that order could be restored. He understood this dynamic far too well, so well that it no longer surprised him. Yet the pain still spread from his chest to his stomach, like a bruise that would never fade. A male flight attendant whispered to Stephanie, just like last time. Ethan heard it. They were not whispering quietly enough to hide it. They wanted him to hear. They wanted the humiliation to land like a lesson. Mr. Walker, please, stand up. The security officer's voice was not loud, but it was enough to silence the entire cabin. Ethan lifted his head, the looks pouring down on him, some satisfied, some relieved that order had been restored, some pretending a thin layer of sympathy, but not one of them brave enough to speak up for him. Ethan rose, slowly, careful to steady every breath, not because he feared being restrained, but because he knew that one wrong movement, one misplaced frown, would become the justification they were waiting for. "You are doing exactly what we were concerned about," Mark Peters said, in a low, needling voice, as if daring him to snap. "I have not done anything wrong." Ethan answered each word, striking like metal on metal, cold and unyielding. Richard Caldwell folded his arms and leaned against the edge of seat 1A, wearing the smug expression of someone who believed he had just won a battle. Finally, he muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "Everything is back where it belongs. Back where it belongs." Those words drilled into Ethan's mind like a sneer that had echoed through decades. What did they mean? That he should be in the back of the plane, that he did not deserve to sit near them, that his entire life should be spent standing behind a long line of people considered more deserving. The two security officers guided Ethan toward the aisle. He could feel the cold overhead lights bearing down on his shoulders, like stage lights, in a theater where he was forced to play the villain. An older woman sighed as he passed. Young people these days know manners. Ethan clenched his teeth. He was not angry at her. He was angry at the system that taught her to think that way. As he stepped out of the aircraft, he heard Stephanie say quietly to Richard, "Thank you for your patience. Guests like you deserve better service." Ethan paused for a heartbeat, as though a jolt of electricity had struck his chest. Guests like you. Then what was he? Someone unworthy, someone inconvenient. Someone automatically assumed to be the problem, simply for not matching the rest of the cabin. His steps grew heavier as he walked into the jet bridge, no longer surrounded by watching eyes, yet still echoing with the humiliation he had just endured. When he exited into the terminal, Mark came up beside him and handed him a small slip of paper, like a token tossed at someone undeserving. "Here. We can offer you a remaining seat in economy. It is the one beside the restroom. If you want to fly, you have to take it." Ethan looked at the paper, a crumpled excuse of a ticket, as distorted as their attitude. "I paid for first class." "You can file an online complaint," Mark replied, without looking at him once, as if Ethan was not worth direct eye contact. Then Mark walked away. No apology. No regret. Only smooth, quiet contempt, the kind delivered by someone who believed this was just another routine a day. Ethan stood still for a long time, long enough that the announcement chime rang 3 times, and he barely registered the words. Only one thought pounded in his mind like a slow drumbeat. If this is how they treat someone with status, money, and power, how much worse would they treat someone with nothing to protect them? Eventually, he returned to the service counter, accepted the economy ticket, and walked to the very back of the plane. Every step was a slice across his pride. The economy cabin was loud, crowded, cramped. His seat was right beside the lavatory where the door sounds, the flushing, and the sharp scent of disinfectant circled endlessly. He sat down, placed his hands on his thighs, and closed his eyes. He wanted to believe all of this was just a mistake. But too many details repeated themselves. Too many patterns reappeared, and he could no longer deny the truth. This was not an error. This was an attitude, a system, a culture. A soft voice rose beside him. "I saw everything." Ethan opened his eyes. A brown-haired woman, around 34 years old, a press badge half hidden under her jacket, was watching him with a steady, serious gaze. "I am Isabella Ramirez." Ethan gave a rough nod. "You must be embarrassed for me. Isabella shook her head. Not just embarrassed. This is evidence, and I collect evidence. Ethan looked at her, and in that instant, a different door opened. One Stephanie Mark and Richard could never imagine. Isabella leaned closer, speaking softly enough for only them to hear. If you want to tell this story, I am ready. Ethan drew in a deep breath. His body still burned with anger, with hurt, with an insult that refused to fade. But beneath the anger, another thought began to form, sharper and clearer with each passing second. They thought they had put him in his place. They thought they had won. They were wrong. Richard Caldwell, Stephanie Moore, and Mark Peters had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Because they did not know that the man they had forced into a seat beside the restroom was powerful enough to buy the entire airline just to make things right. Ethan opened his eyes fully and looked straight ahead at the rows before him, the rows representing the system that had rejected him. And for the first time that night, he smiled. Not the smile of someone enduring, the smile of someone preparing to strike back. What they did tonight would cost them dearly. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew that if he did nothing, they would continue hurting countless others, and Ethan Walker would never allow that. His battle began in that shabby seat at the back of the plane, and it would end at heights they could never imagine. The plane trembled lightly as it lifted off the runway, the lights in the economy cabin dimming until half of Ethan's face sank into shadow, while the other half was lit by the small screen in front of him. The whispers behind him, the restroom door opening and closing, the sound of children crying, all of it blended into a kind of noise that stretched his mind thin. But what hurt most was not the noise. It was the silence of humiliation, that thick, heavy silence a person cannot swallow and cannot put into words. Isabella Ramirez leaned slightly toward him. Do you want to tell me what happened? Ethan looked out the window where the Chicago skyline drifted farther behind them, and he spoke slowly. I'm not sure it would change anything. Isabella let out a soft laugh. The right story at the right moment can change an entire system. I have seen it happen many times. Ethan said nothing. There was something in her tone that made him pause, a certainty that came not from emotion, but from experience. Isabella pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket, its pages crowded with messy writing markings, crossed-out names replaced by new ones. I am working on an investigative series about racial discrimination in the airline industry. I have been gathering evidence for almost 1 year. There are too many stories like yours. But those people do not have a voice. They do not have power. Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes catching a sharp metallic glint. You think I have power? Not think, she answered immediately, I know. The way you looked at Mark when they forced you out of your seat, the way you stayed, calm the way you refused to bow your head. I have seen that look before, in people who refuse to let the system crush them. Ethan exhaled. I am not a hero. I am just someone trying to get on a plane to do my job. No. Isabella said quietly but firmly. You are someone who has been treated unfairly your entire life, yet still chooses to stand up at the right moment. Her words hit the deepest part of him. He did not want to admit it, but she was right. And the truth stung. He leaned back, and the memories surged like a flood without warning. He remembered being followed in a store at 16 years old. Remembered the security guard asking, "Do you even have enough money for that?" Remembered being a young engineer and hearing, "Do you work in maintenance or tech?" even while he was standing in front of the team, presenting his own designs. Remembered walking into the office of the company he founded, only to be asked by security for identification because he did not look like someone who worked there. Each moment was like a shard of glass lodged in his chest. He had lived with them so long he no longer counted them. But tonight that shard had turned at just the right angle and reflected a truth Ethan could no longer ignore. His silence was part of the problem. The plane leveled off the cabin, lights brightened softly, and a group of flight attendants passed by. Stephanie Moore was among them, now assigned to economy. She glanced at Ethan and whispered to a colleague, "He is still sitting there. Must not have had the money to buy the real ticket." Another attendant laughed. Maybe he used someone's card. People like that always try to sneak into first class. Ethan heard it. Isabella heard it. And this time it was more than an insult. It was a confession proof that they saw discrimination as routine. Ethan remained calm, but the anger inside him was no longer the anger of a man insulted. It was the anger of someone watching a system of injustice operate smoothly in plain sight. "You should record everything they say," Isabella murmured. Ethan lifted his phone. He had already turned on the recording the moment he sat down in economy. A soft notification chimed, an urgent email from Daniel Brooks. Ethan opened it. Skyway Airlines is facing severe financial instability. They are searching for a private investor to buy shares. Ethan read every line, and his anger slowly sharpened into calculation. He stared at the screen as though a hidden map had just revealed itself. An airline desperate for money, a board of directors panicking, a discriminatory culture running unchecked, and a man with the resources to change all of it. "Are you thinking what I am thinking?" Isabella asked, eyes narrowing. Maybe Ethan replied, "I am thinking that if no one cleans up this system, then I will." Isabella smiled the kind of smile someone gives when a storm turns into lightning. "If you really do that, the entire industry will shake." Ethan closed his phone, not to end the moment, but to begin the battle. Everything Mark, Stephanie, and Richard believed they had quietly resolved would not disappear. It would become evidence laid on the table in front of Skyway's highest executives. And this time, no one would ignore him. No one would ask him to leave the aircraft again. Ethan looked out the window where the moonlight glimmered on the wing like a blade. "They chose the wrong man to humiliate," he said slowly, "and they will pay for it." Ahead of him was not just San Francisco, not just a negotiation, but a chance to rewrite the future of an entire industry that had stayed stagnant for too long. In the seat beside the restroom, surrounded by flushing sounds and hurried footsteps, a plan was forming. A plan not for revenge, but to transform the sky itself. Ethan Walker opened his eyes, clear, steady, resolved. And in the quiet of that night flight, a vow rose silently within him. "They pulled me out of first class. I will pull them out of the system of discrimination they rely on to survive." His battle began here, and it would not end until the sky belonged to everyone. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin settled into a soft blue glow, Ethan opened his laptop and typed his password with a speed that felt instinctive. Numbers appeared, financial charts of Skyway Airlines, sliding across the screen under the dim cabin lights. And in that moment, with the steady vibration of the aircraft humming like a heartbeat, he saw clearly the picture his finance team had been quietly warning him about. Skyway was bleeding out. Badly. And they were doing everything in their power to hide it. A confident airline does not sell shares in secret. A healthy airline does not fear real investors examining their books. But Skyway, the same airline that had shoved him into economy like misplaced luggage, was standing on the edge of a cliff, and Ethan Walker was the man who could decide whether they fell or stood back up. Isabella glanced over her voice, low but sharp. "You look like someone who just found the enemy's weak point." Ethan did not deny it. "Their weakness is not finances." "Then what is it?" "Arrogance," Ethan said, eyes still fixed on the screen. "They are certain everything will always stay in their control. That someone like me will bow his head. That no one has the power to challenge who they really are." Isabella leaned back, studying him. She had interviewed many victims of discrimination, but very few possessed the ability to turn humiliation into strategy, and almost none had the power to do it on a national scale. But Ethan was different. He was not just someone who had been wronged, he was someone who had the tools to dismantle the very system that wronged him. An email popped up in the corner of his screen. I dug into Skyway's legal structure. Their parent company depends on 2 major investors who are preparing to pull out from Amara. Ethan's lips lifted slightly. Amara Johnson, his chief legal officer, never messaged unless she had uncovered something significant. "They need a bailout," he murmured more to himself than to Isabella. It seems so. And then he began typing. A message to Daniel Brooks. "Approach the investors selling shares. Use a shell company. Do not reveal Horizon Dynamics." Less than 3 minutes later, Daniel replied. "Understood. We can initiate the acquisition process tonight." Ethan stared at the message, as though a door had opened in front of him. A door leading to something no one on this plane, not Mark, not Stephanie, not Richard could ever imagine. A silent takeover. No noise, no announcement powerful enough to blow apart the discriminatory culture Skyway had built over decades. Another notification flashed on his phone. "I'm investigating past lawsuits. There are signs. Skyway shut down complaints with non-disclosure agreements." From Amara. Ethan felt heat rise through him, but this time it was not anger. It was momentum. "Are you really going to buy Skyway?" Isabella asked, half stunned, half exhilarated. "I am going to buy the silence they depend on," Ethan replied. "And then I am going to tear it apart." The plane shuddered slightly as it entered a pocket of cold air. Lights flickered, but nothing in the cabin's movement could shake Ethan now. Everything had aligned in his mind. The scattered pieces of tonight's humiliation were assembling into a complete strategy. A moment later, as the beverage cart rolled past, he heard Stephanie whisper to a colleague. "He is still sitting there. Probably caused trouble somewhere else, too." Soft laughter followed. Isabella shot them a furious glare, but Ethan only shook his head. "They do not understand." "Understand what?" "That they just dug their own grave." In that moment, a deeper clarity settled over Ethan. He finally understood that this was no longer just about him. Not just about a rejected boarding pass. Not just about a stolen seat. Not just about tonight's humiliation. It was a miniature version of a larger problem, one woven into society for decades. People with privilege believing they have the right to decide who is worthy of respect and who is not. And Ethan, a man who had endured a lifetime of those cuts, had reached the day he could no longer stand on the sidelines. He wanted to rewrite the script. As the plane sank deeper into the night sky, Ethan opened a new document and typed the title. Skyway Reform Plan Initial Strategy. He typed non-stop each sentence, a hammer blow against the rotten culture of the airline. He wrote, "Gather evidence, acquire controlling shares, replace leadership, rebuild customer service policies, reinvestigate all discrimination cases, put fairness at the foundation, and finally, Never allow anyone to experience what I experienced tonight." Isabella glanced at the screen, eyes widening. "You are planning a revolution." Ethan smiled faintly. "No, I'm just fixing one flight." But both of them knew he was lying. This was not repair. This was dismantling, rebuilding, dragging an entire system from the shadows into the light, using whatever means necessary, including absolute ownership. Ethan leaned back for a moment and closed his eyes. But his mind was anything but calm. He was calculating every step, every move in the chain he would begin, the moment the plane touched down in San Francisco. He did not just want Skyway to apologize. He wanted them to change, to face the truth, to be held accountable. And if that required buying the entire airline, he would do it. With every ounce of power, anger, and determination life had forged into him. The seatbelt sign illuminated. A voice came over the speaker. "We are preparing for landing." Ethan opened his eyes. "Good," he said softly. "I have work to do." And as the wheels touched the runway, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. The people who dragged him out of first class would never forget that they had awakened a man who refused to bow, a man who could, and soon would, change the fate of Skyway Airlines. Ethan's battle had officially begun. When Ethan stepped into the cold night air of San Francisco, the chill hit his face, but it was nowhere near strong enough to cool the slow, burning heat rising in his chest. The sting of humiliation clung to him like a callus that had not yet healed, but now it had hardened into something sharper, something that fueled every step he took away from the aircraft. The private Horizon Dynamics car was already waiting. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, ready to ask if he was all right, but the look in Ethan's eyes silenced him immediately. Ethan didn't want to talk, not because he was shaken, but because his mind was moving too fast for small answers. He was calculating, shaping, preparing. As the car sped along the roads leading into downtown San Francisco, the city lights streaked across the windows, like trails of thought racing through Ethan's mind. A rotten system is not built by one act of injustice, but by thousands of small ones repeated quietly in the shadows. And to dismantle it, he would have to tear away every layer that hid it. His phone lit up with a message from Amara Johnson. "I just obtained Skyway's internal training materials. You should see this." Ethan opened the file. It was not an outright document of discrimination. They were not foolish enough to write that down. But every line revealed the truth they thought they could hide. Pay attention to unusual behavior from passengers who do not fit the standard customer profile. Increase verification for passengers from high-risk demographics. Prioritize service for familiar customers with strong transaction history and a professional appearance. Professional appearance. Ethan's lips tightened. That phrase was the trap. A polished mechanism allowing discrimination to operate without ever naming it. "They teach their staff to be suspicious of people like me," he whispered, mostly to himself. Another message appeared from Daniel. "The share brokerage agreed to meet our shell company representative tomorrow morning. Skyway's largest shareholder is desperate to sell 25%. Ethan made a mental note. Buy 25% first. Squeeze the subsidiary funds. Clean out the rest before they realize. But the financial plan was only one battleground. He needed to understand Skyway from its roots, not just numbers, but culture structure, and the polished facade they used to conceal a freezing core beneath it. At the Fairmont Hotel, Ethan met Isabella and a slender middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and sharp, weary eyes. Michael Harris, former Human Resources Director of Skyway. Mr. Walker. Michael said, shaking his hand with the steady grip of someone who had been fighting battles in the dark. I hear you finally experienced who they really are. Ethan sat eyes fixed on him. I want to know everything. Michael opened an old leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Internal emails, buried reports, meeting transcripts and complaint letters the company had never answered. 3 years ago, I presented a report showing passengers of color were subjected to additional screening 6 times more often than white passengers. They told me I was overcomplicating things. He handed over another sheet. I documented that complaints from less privileged customers had an 80% chance of being categorized as insufficient grounds. They told me I was too sensitive. Ethan took each page, and every paper felt like another cup of fuel poured onto his fire. They fired me 2 weeks later. Michael added quietly, bitterness glinting deep in his eyes. Isabella leaned in. And this, she pressed play on an audio clip. Mark Peters' mocking voice filled the room. I swear I do not know why they pay for first class. They do not look like they can afford it. Stephanie's laugh followed. Exactly. Someone like that belongs in economy. Ethan closed his eyes, his hand tightening until his knuckles turned white. I thought they were simply outstanding in their ignorance tonight. He opened his eyes, his voice dropping like sharpened steel. Turns out they practice it daily. Michael nodded, resting his hand on the stack of documents. Skyway is not collapsing because of one decision. They are collapsing because of culture. Ethan stared directly at him. I will tear it apart. Isabella asked, how Ethan leaned forward, the warm, golden light of the meeting room reflecting off his eyes like the edge of a blade being drawn. I am going to buy Skyway. I will expose them before they even understand what is happening. And once they lose power, I will rebuild their culture from the ground up. Michael let out a soft laugh, not mocking but relieved, like someone who had waited years to hear those words. They will panic. Ethan glanced at his phone. A notification flashed. Available cash balance, $3 billion. Good, he whispered with quiet determination. Isabella exhaled, sinking back into her chair. You know this will shake the entire industry. It has to, Ethan replied. Earthquakes reveal the fractures. Michael studied Ethan for a long moment before speaking. You're not just buying an airline. You're buying back the silence of thousands who were treated unfairly. Ethan nodded. And I intend to return that silence to them as a voice. The meeting stretched past midnight. When Michael finally left, Ethan stood before the hotel window, looking down at San Francisco, glowing like a network of golden veins. He knew this was not about revenge. It was not about ego. It was because he understood he stood in a place many others could never reach. He had power. He had money. He had a voice. And if he did not act, no one would. The city lights reflected on his face a mix of weariness and unshakable resolve. Tomorrow, Ethan said slowly, as if swearing an oath to the night sky, Skyway will begin to fall. And not because they pushed me out of seat 1A, but because they underestimated the one man they should never have underestimated. The battle was no longer about where he sat on the plane. It was about who would sit in the leadership seat of Skyway. And Ethan Walker was ready to claim that seat. Without permission. Without waiting. Without stepping back. Beginning tonight. The morning mist of San Francisco draped a thin veil over the skyscrapers as Ethan stepped into the private conference room at the Fairmont Hotel, where Daniel Brooks and Chief Legal Officer Amara Johnson, were already waiting. No one spoke. No one needed to. Both of them saw in Ethan's eyes a cold, forged resolve, a steel sharpened by the previous night. On the table lay 3 folders, stamped Urgent Skyway's detailed financial reports, a full list of major shareholders, and a risk analysis outlining what would happen if the company lost even one more source of capital. "We begin," Ethan said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of an approaching storm. Daniel pulled up a presentation. "The investor most desperate is Northbridge Capital. They hold 25%. If we acquire that block, the rest will be easy to gather." Amara slid a packet across the table. "Skyway has over-leveraged sold assets quietly to stay afloat. They hid this in their quarterly reports. If you want to use this as leverage, now is the time." Ethan nodded. He did not need to break Skyway. Skyway had already broken itself. He only needed to open the door they had been sealing with old tape made of years of lies. "Use shell companies," Ethan said. "No one can know it is me." Daniel smirked faintly. "I already created 6 entities. I am adding more." "No," Ethan corrected his gaze, sharp as a laser edge. "We need 20. Daniel froze for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. 20 shell companies, 20 streams of money, 20 different purchase routes, spreading like a web, ensuring no one could trace the center. A silent assault, a tightening noose with no sound." Ethan opened his laptop and reviewed every number, every chart, every hidden debt Skyway had buried at the bottom of their reports. His finger paused over one of Daniel's notes. "Skyway will not survive losing another investor. If someone gains control too quickly, they will panic." Ethan let a corner of his mouth rise. "Good." Meanwhile, Amara was on a call with a New York law firm. "We want a completely silent arrangement. Send your fee proposal." Ethan listened only partially, but he knew exactly how this division worked. Amara would handle the legal battlefield, Daniel would handle the financial battlefield, and he, the man they had dismissed the night before, would deliver the final strike. A notification chimed from Ethan's phone, a message from Isabella. "I found 4 more employees willing to talk, and a former manager confirmed Skyway deleted complaint records from passengers of color." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the anger sharpen into focus. He understood now that this fight was no longer about what they did to him. It was about what they had done to an entire community for years, Daniel reported suddenly. "Northbridge agreed to meet the shell company at 9 this morning. Ethan responded instantly. "Offer them 3% above market. They are desperate. They will sell." "What about the smaller shareholders?" Daniel asked. "Buy them all. Tonight or early morning. Just do it." Daniel nodded, eyes lit with the thrill of a national-scale acquisition. When Ethan stepped out of the meeting room, his phone buzzed non-stop emails from analysts, reports from brokerage firms, updates from the financial monitoring system. He walked through the hotel hallway like a general crossing a battlefield, each step steady, each breath synchronized with the frantic machinery of the economic engine behind him. The third call came from Daniel. "We acquired 12%. 2 hours later, 17%. An hour after, 22%. By afternoon, as Ethan rode through the city with skyscrapers sliding past the car windows, Daniel sent a message consisting of only 3 words. 25% complete. Ethan did not smile, but a hot electric current ran through him from chest to fingertips. "Continue," he replied. The offensive had gone too deep for anyone to pull back. Each percentage purchased was another blow to Skyway's foundation. They did not know. They did not see. They kept selling tickets. kept serving customers, kept discriminating, kept believing the power was still in their hands, when in reality, that power was draining out of them by the hour. By 8 that evening, Ethan stood alone at the top floor window, looking down at the glowing map of San Francisco, when Daniel's name lit up his screen. "Ethan, you need to hear this," Ethan answered. Daniel spoke slowly, each word dropping like a pebble into still water. "We reached 41%. Ethan inhaled. 10% more. I'm approaching Western Ridge. They want out of the aviation sector. Buy them. Are you sure if Skyway discovers Ethan cut him off? By the time they discover, it will be too late. At 9 o'clock, 43%. At 10:47%. At 11:49%. And then at 11:38, Daniel's message lit the screen. Western Ridge chairman agreed to sell. Ethan did not blink. Execute. 1 minute. 2. 3. Then Daniel called. Not a message. A call. Ethan picked up. No greeting. No build-up. Just 2 words. "It's done." Ethan stared out at the city, his reflection in the window. No longer that of a man humiliated on a plane, but a man prepared to rewrite the rules. "Daniel," Ethan said quietly, "how much do we own?" Daniel exhaled, breath trembling with adrenaline. "Ethan, we now hold 51.3%. Silence stretched heavy and electric. Ethan placed a hand on the cold glass. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady, as Stone Skyway will learn who they belong to. And then, for the first time that day, Ethan allowed himself a small, quiet smile at one singular thought. The man they dragged out of seat 1A, the one they dismissed with cold indifference, now owned the aircraft they humiliated him on, and the entire airline behind it. That night, San Francisco's sky had no idea an earthquake had just formed, but Ethan knew, and by the next morning, everything would begin to change. That afternoon, when the clock in Skyway's grand lobby struck 1:55, Ethan Walker stepped into the headquarters of the airline he had just quietly taken over. No one knew. No one suspected. No one could have imagined that the man in the elegant grey suit was now the owner of the entire company. The polished glass floor reflected his silhouette in 2 sharp, commanding lines. The receptionist looked up and offered a polite smile, completely unaware that she had once worked for the company that dragged this very man out of first class, and that innocent ignorance made one thing clearer than ever to Ethan: those who harm others always believe the consequences will never find their way back to them. Ethan sat in the lobby like any other visitor, but he was not just sitting. He was studying. He watched a security guard check the badge of a black female employee while allowing 2 white employees to pass without question. He noticed a manager frown the moment he heard a janitor speaking English with an accent. He saw every small detail, the same small details that formed a larger, deeper, more toxic system. A system that needed to be dismantled from within. At 1:58, Ethan rose and walked to the elevator unhurried. He wanted Skyway to witness every second of this moment, the moment truth began to shift. On the top floor, the conference room door was slightly open, tense voices spilling out. Chief Executive Officer Franklin Hayes was briefing the board, his tone anxious, despite his attempt to sound composed. "Someone is trying to take us over. Buying shares from multiple sources. Very organized. Very fast." A board member slammed his hand on the table. Why did the Financial Oversight Department not detect it earlier? Franklin flushed red. They used layers of shell companies. We could not trace the origin. "Then what do you know?" someone demanded. "I know we are being pushed to the edge," Franklin said, sweat gathering at his temples. If we lose control of our shares before we secure new capital, we will. The conference room door swung open. Everyone turned. Ethan stood there, uninvited, unexpected, unpredictable. Shock rippled through the room like a cold wave. Mark Peters, the man who had ordered security to remove Ethan from the aircraft, went pale instantly. Stephanie Moore froze mid-sip her coffee cup, trembling until liquid splashed over the rim. Both of them stared at Ethan as if a ghost had walked into the room. Franklin frowned, not recognizing him at all. "I am sorry, this is a closed board meeting." "Who are you?" Ethan stepped forward, placed a folder on the table, and spoke with a calmness sharp enough to split the air. "I believe I am the one you are looking for." Confusion swept the room. Franklin let out a nervous laugh. "Which investor are you, legal representative of whom? How did you even get in here?" Ethan opened the folder and slid it to the center of the table. "I am the person you have been calling the takeover threat." Franklin swallowed hard. "Impossible." A board member picked up the document. As he read, his eyes widened with every line. This is the ownership notice signed by Next Horizon Holdings. This company controls 51.3% of Skyway Airlines. Silence fell heavy and absolute. Stephanie dropped her coffee cup. It shattered across the white tiles. Mark staggered back, his face drained of color. Franklin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ethan's expression remained calm, yet unbearably sharp as he said, "To avoid confusion, the person who owns that 51.3% is me." The entire room froze. In that moment, the only sound was the frantic pounding of the hearts belonging to those who had once used their power to belittle him, now forced to face the truth that their power had vanished. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat at the head of the table, the chairman's seat, the seat that once belonged to Franklin. No one stopped him. Not even Franklin dared breathe too loudly. "I am Ethan Walker," he declared, his voice ringing with the finality of a bell, marking the end of an era. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Dynamics, and as of today, I am the new Executive Chairman of Skyway Airlines. A board member tried to regain control, but this happened too fast." "When did you buy the shares?" Ethan answered with a smile devoid of warmth. "While you were busy discriminating against your own customers." Mark shot to his feet, voice shaking. "About last night it was a misunderstanding." Ethan raised one hand. Mark fell silent instantly. "I know exactly what happened last night. And I also recorded everything." Stephanie burst into tears. "I did not mean it. I was just following procedure." Ethan looked straight at her, the anger gone, replaced by a far deeper disappointment. "If this is your procedure, then Skyway needs to be rebuilt from the ground up." Franklin attempted to salvage authority. "Walker, if you want to negotiate," Ethan interrupted, his voice striking with final, immovable force. "I do not negotiate with discrimination. I replace it." He opened his laptop and connected it to the screen. The footage appeared Ethan being pulled from seat 1, A. Richard Caldwell, sneering, Stephanie obeying him, Mark coldly calling security. With each passing second, the room grew heavier, the truth pressing down like lead. When the video ended, Ethan delivered the sentence that made every person in the room bow their head. "Last night you treated me as someone unworthy of respect. Today I decide how Skyway will treat every person from this moment forward." He rose from his seat. His voice was no longer the voice of a man who had been humiliated, but the voice of someone who now shaped the destiny of an entire company. "Franklin Hayes." As of this moment, you are suspended pending investigation. Mark Peters, Stephanie Moore, you will leave Skyway immediately. Human resources will secure your records." No one objected. No one dared. They understood this was not a mistake in customer service. This was the collapse of an entire culture. Ethan looked around the room at the faces that once held power, now lowered in fear. And he ended the meeting with a line that would be remembered in aviation history. "Skyway pushed me out of first class, but I am pulling Skyway out of the lowest culture it has ever known. Starting today, everything changes." No applause followed. No one spoke. But everyone understood a new chapter had opened. And the man writing it was the very one they once dismissed. In a single night, Ethan Walker transformed humiliation into absolute authority. And Skyway Airlines now belonged to him. Immediately after the suspension and termination orders were delivered, the conference room, already silent, fell into something close to paralysis, as if all the air had been pulled out of it. Ethan stood before the projection screen, not raising his voice, not showing anger, yet the weight in his gaze alone made everyone understand that the old era ended the moment he walked through the door. Those who once held power now shrank into their seats, while Ethan's new legal team spread documents across the table like investigators preparing to analyze the scene of a crime that had lasted for years. Ethan gave the floor to Amara Johnson, the only person in the room who showed no hint of fear. She opened a thick folder, her voice clear and colder than the neon lights above them. "In the past 3 years, Skyway has refused to process 87% of discrimination-related complaints, most of them closed with the reason of insufficient evidence. However, airport camera systems show that the majority of passengers subjected to excessive screening were passengers of color." A board member exhaled sharply, his face burning with shame. Another turned away. But Ethan was not about to let anyone escape the truth. He played a new audio clip, the voices of Stephanie and Mark in an internal meeting, laughing about passengers who did not look like they belonged in first class, their tone so devoid of empathy that even their former colleagues bowed their heads, unable to keep listening. When the recording ended, Ethan spoke with a flat, emotionless firmness that carried the weight of final judgment. Skyway did not suffer one mistake. Skyway nurtured this culture from its roots, and we will pull it out layer by layer. In the corner, Stephanie sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Mark struggled to maintain composure, his hands twisting together uncontrollably. Franklin Hayes, once the figure at the top of the hierarchy, now sat like a hollow shadow as he was asked to surrender his access card and digital signature. But Ethan was not stopping at firing a few people. He was not interested in leaving behind an empty shell. He intended to rebuild Skyway into something responsible and real. He turned to the board, his voice rising like a vow. "Today we establish a new cultural review board under my direct supervision. Every hiring process, every training protocol, every customer service guideline will be rewritten from zero." Nods began appearing around the table, hesitant at first, then stronger as people finally realized Ethan was not destroying the company, but saving it from the rot they had refused to acknowledge. Amara continued, "We will reopen all rejected cases from the last 5 years. Any passenger who was mistreated will receive a formal apology, a refund, and compensation. Any employee who attempted to report discriminatory behavior but was ignored will be invited back if they choose." Ethan interrupted with a decision that made several heads snap up. "Additionally, we will establish the Air Justice Fund. Any customer who has ever suffered discrimination from Skyway will receive free legal support to reopen their case." Several jaws dropped. This was not punishment. This was a revolution. Ethan looked around, his gaze no longer angry, but carrying the weight of a man offering a chance to rebuild. "Those who choose to change will move forward with me. Those who are not ready may leave Skyway today." A long silence settled over the room. Then a middle-aged board member rose. "I have worked here 22 years. I have seen everything, but I never had the courage to speak. I want to be part of this change." Others began standing, as well as if their fear had finally cracked under the weight of a new overdue hope. But not everyone chose to step toward the light. A few conservative leaders exchanged resentful glances, understanding their era was over. Ethan let them walk away without hesitation. As the meeting neared its end, the door suddenly opened. Paula Martinez stepped in with a camera crew, bright lights casting sharp reflections across the faces of those who had just lost everything. "Mr. Walker," she said, "our viewers want to know, what will you do next after this historic takeover?" Ethan turned toward the camera without missing a beat. "I will build an airline where every passenger is treated with dignity, not because they have a platinum card or a fine suit, but because they are human." The room fell silent again, not from fear this time, but because the simplicity of that truth had never been a core value of Skyway. Ethan looked around one last time and said, "Tomorrow we begin." And as he walked out of the conference room, the air behind him shifted completely, an old era collapsing, a new one rising. Skyway was no longer the airline that humiliated him. It had become the creation he would rebuild with his own hands. The battle was not over, but for the first time, Ethan saw real hope. In the weeks that followed, Skyway felt like a body newly anesthetized, bracing for the largest surgery in its history. Ethan stepped into every meeting room, every review session, every staff discussion, like a surgeon tracing each clogged artery and every cultural tumor that had grown unchecked for years. Employees who once viewed him as an unfit passenger now stood straight before him, partly out of fear for their jobs, but mostly because something in Ethan's steady gaze made them realize he had not come to punish. He had come to repair. He did not need them to kneel. He needed them to understand responsibility. The new training program launched not a series of shallow skill videos played half-heartedly as before, but direct conversations, realistic scenario simulations, and classes on unconscious bias. During the first session, a flight attendant broke into tears when she realized she had spent years treating passengers of color as potential risks simply because of vague instructions passed down from above. "I did not know I hurt so many people." Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said softly, "Realizing it is the first step toward change." In the lobby of headquarters, new internal reporting boxes were installed. Within 72 hours, over 300 reports were submitted from employees denied advancement opportunities to passengers who suffered discrimination that no one had ever addressed. Ethan read every single report himself. He did not delegate it. He needed to feel their pain with his own heart to remind himself why this battle had begun, not to restore his wounded pride, but to protect those who never had the chance to protect themselves. One morning, Ethan called the entire senior management team into the conference room. Starting today, Skyway will no longer judge passengers by appearance. Every passenger will be treated as a priority. We do not serve wallets, we serve people. A few managers exchanged skeptical looks, but Ethan held their eyes and added, "If you prefer serving wallets, you may need to find another airline." Unexpectedly, instead of resistance, the room exhaled as though someone had finally spoken aloud what no one had dared say. Perhaps something in Ethan's blunt honesty revealed a direction they had never been brave enough to propose. But not everyone embraced the change. A small group of long-time employees muttered that Ethan was turning Skyway into a social experiment. A few resigned, saying they could not endure political correctness. Ethan did not stop them. He knew true transformation could never be built on those unwilling to transform themselves. Meanwhile, those once silenced under the old system began to rise. An Asian flight attendant said during a team meeting, "For the first time, I feel my voice matters." A young black employee said, "I used to be afraid to apply for first-class crew training. Now I want to try." Ethan smiled at these words, knowing they were signs of genuine rebirth. But internal change was only half the battle. He also had to face the public competitors and investors, all asking, "Why is a technology CEO reshaping an airline from the inside out?" Ethan answered in a nationally televised press conference, "Because I can, and because I must. Ignoring injustice when you have the power to change it is a form of complicity." The press began calling him the breaker of the silence cycle, the man rewriting aviation's rule book. But Ethan did not care for titles. He cared about results. 3 months after the takeover, the statistics were announced. Discrimination complaints dropped 93%. Passenger satisfaction rose 28%. Employee turnover fell by nearly half. Most remarkably, Skyway achieved stable profitability for the first time in 7 years. Ethan stood in his new office, looking out over the aircraft lined across the tarmac. He remembered the feeling of being pulled from seat 1A, the humiliation, the pain, the helplessness. But if not for that night, he would never have begun this journey. A call came in from Daniel. "Ethan, a passenger, just sent an email thanking you." She said her 13-year-old son had once been insulted on a Skyway flight, but today a flight attendant apologized sincerely and offered compensation. She said, "Because of you, the boy believes in justice again." Ethan went silent for a few seconds. Every effort, every sleepless night, every hard decision, all for moments like that. He smiled, not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who finally sees light at the end of a long tunnel. "We are not done yet," Ethan said into the phone, "but we are moving in the right direction." When he ended the call, Ethan understood one truth clearly. They might have pulled him out of first class, but they could not pull him away from the mission he had chosen. Because now he was no longer just a passenger. He was the one steering the sky. Skyway had changed, and Ethan Walker was the reason. From the perspective of an expert in organizational culture and the dynamics of power, the journey of Ethan Walker reveals a truth that never grows old. Injustice does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, hidden beneath procedures, policies, and familiar glances that become so normalized we no longer notice them. What Ethan accomplished was not merely the acquisition of an airline, it was the resetting of the standard for human dignity in an industry long shaped by unspoken biases. He proved that true power does not come from retaliation, but from the ability to transform an entire structure so that those who are more vulnerable can stand tall without fear of being pushed back. If this story resonates with you, please like the video to help spread its message of courage and responsibility. Do not forget to subscribe so you can follow the journeys of justice still ahead. And before you go, comment the phrase, "change now," as a reminder that each of us has the ability to ignite the transformation of an entire system.